Never in my life did I think I would meet so many communists. And the reason for this being that in Romania, communism as well as Nazism are banned ideologies. They are considered to be incompatible with the human experience. But on Twitter, you do have the pleasure of meeting a lot of individuals with communist paraphernalia in their bio who openly advocate for Marxism. And I was a little bit interested in wondering why that is. Now, at first, you would expect that most of these people are coming from communist nations, just wanting to share their way of life with other people. However, you notice that's not the case. Most of these individuals come from the United States, they come from the United Kingdom, they come from Canada or Germany and France. So you wonder why do they want communism, and mostly respond with the fact that they view their countries as being unjust. But they don't compare their countries with other countries. They compare their countries with the correct utopia. They compare with the ideal country on how the world should be, but that country never really existed. So it's interesting to compare their countries with other countries that have gotten through Marxism. Whether they're Marxist today or not, they had a Marxist revolution which promised them change. So if you look at people from Canada, for example, recently they're very upset about historical grievances, and they will say that they don't want to celebrate Canadian holiday anymore because of what happened in the past. And Canadian holiday should be a day of shame, not a day of celebration. Which is kind of funny because I want to see a nation in the world that's actually proud of its history and heritage. And the one that comes to mind is China. You see, recently China is celebrating its 100 years of communism, and it's a very proud day for the Chinese people. Even CNN had a very proud message to share with the American people about the glory and realization of China. I'll put that in This Week in Stupid. But what's interesting is, like, how does China deal with the problems of its past? Because you see, if you're looking at a Western country and you think, oh my god, like the horrors of the past, how does China deal with its own problems? And the answer is by censorship. You see, censorship seems to be the best way of silencing Marxist activists. In China, for example, they have this concept of nihilistic history. And nihilistic history is the type of history that goes against what the Chinese Communist Party is advocating for. So, for example, bringing up the Great Leap Forward is already dangerous territory. Because in the Great Leap Forward, it's estimated that around 15 million, all the way up to 45 million people have perished because of a famine that was mismanaged by the government. So by banning people from talking about it means that there is no more problem. There is no more divide between the communist people. Everyone agreed that China is amazing and it never did anything wrong. This goes to the point where people who push for historical nihilism on social media get banned, but as well as encouraging others to tell authorities when their family members or friends are committing historical nihilism. So I guess, like, this is the solution for nations like the United States or Canada. Hey, you talk about some atrocities that the US committed? Well, let's remove that from social media, just like we remove any type of misinformation nowadays. And the other thing that communists are talking about, why they don't like the West, is because of the atrocities the West has committed. They will say, yes, like the Great Leap Forward is overly exaggerated, and let's say that indeed 15 million have perished, but what about the worst that the US is doing within the world? What about the imperialism and the people that the United States have killed? And to that, you have to respond with the fact that human beings are very territorial creatures. And throughout history, any nation, regardless of its form of government, if it had the possibility to expand, it did so at the detriment of its own neighbors. However, not many nations that I know in human history have managed to kill 45 million people of their own citizens during peacetime. So what I'm going with this is that stopping people from committing wars is a lot more difficult. You would need the invention of nuclear weapons and the consensus of most world powers to agree that kinetic warfare is bad. And only then can we even start and begin to put an end to world wars and other atrocities that human beings commit upon each other. But to make sure that you don't have a government that kills 45 million of your own citizens, in my opinion, it's a little bit more accomplishable. Okay, so how did the Great Famine actually happen? Well, it happened once China and the USSR met, and the USSR said that in 5 years it wants to overtake the United States when it comes to industrialization. And China took the goal of the United Kingdom. They wanted to overtake them. So this is called the 5-year plan for the Soviets and the second 5-year plan for the Chinese. Now, in order to overtake them in industrial and agricultural production, China decided to A, collectivize farming, and B, move a lot of peasants from the field into the factories. Now, as I mentioned before, humans are very territorial creatures and they don't really appreciate when the government takes away the land that they perceive their own. And because of that, many farmers resisted, and a lot of farmers simply killed their livestock rather than to give it away to the state. But that's no problem because the communists had a solution for these people. They were labeled as counter-revolutionaries, they were labeled as right-wingers, I'm not making this up. And they were summarily gotten rid of. So no more peasants, no more problem. Now, once they managed to collectivize the land, once they managed to take away property away from people, they created what was called communal farming. And communal farming means that you don't get to work your land anymore. You get to work the people's land, but it's not really yours. So the problem with this is that it's very much similar to how serfdom in medieval time existed. I mean, you get to work on the noble's land, but you just give it to the noble and then the noble redistributes it accordingly. So that was the new system. And as you can imagine, most peasants weren't really happy with this new arrangement, meaning that they already started working less than they would have if it was their own land, and they knew that the labor that they put into it would reward them in the end. Basically, they figured out that if they put less work in it, they still get the same amount of goods. So it's not really required to put more effort than the minimum one that you have to. Now, because of the 5-year plan, the Communist Party, they desired certain quotas. They demanded, just like human resources demand out of the employee of a company, to accomplish certain targets that were ridiculous in nature and scope, to the point where most peasants weren't able to accomplish them, and they had to work day and night on the field just to keep up with the ridiculous quotas. And one of the main issues is, just like you have in corporations nowadays, you have HR, like the people that are the bosses, but they don't really know how the work in the company is being done. All they know is like charts and percentages. They will demand things from the employees that are actually not the way things are done or supposed to be done. So in communism, they demanded that the peasants, for example, plant seeds more closely. Because by planting them more closely, well, they thought that in the same amount of land, you can now have more plants growing. I mean, it's a wasted space to plant them so far apart. But the reason you plant them far apart is because if you plant them too closely, then plants don't grow, which is what they noticed. But any peasant or farmer that pointed this out would be considered a counter-revolutionary or a right-winger. And because of that, the farmers shut the fuck up, and they just did what they were told. Unfortunately, by suppressing information and by keeping reality away from people doesn't really change the fabric of reality. And indeed, the output was far below of expectations. And various communist leaders, various party members, they tried doing various tricks in order to lie about their output production. They planted the crops closer to the roads so that when Mao would travel the roads, he would see the plants closer, and they would think that the harvest is indeed more bountiful. By lying, they managed to convince the leader that all was well, that there is no problem to be done. So by enforcing a culture where people lie to each other, where people push misinformation on a daily basis, and everyone that speaks the truth gets punished, they helped create the illusion that everything is indeed going well. And because of that, Mao actually declared that people should eat 5 meals a day, because now China is so wealthy and so productive that there is no reason to not partake into 5 meals per day. And as people lived in communal farmings, they also ate at cantinas where you would get served 5 meals a day. And most people did take advantage of it, which is something that's going to bite them in the ass once the real famine kicks in. Now, all this would have been bad by itself, but the bad practices continued. You see, expert says, research shows, scientists claim that the sparrow is indeed a huge problem. The calculations that the experts made was that the sparrow eats around 4 pounds of grain per year. And that's just one sparrow. Now, millions of sparrows divide by 4, yeah. So they realized that they should start a campaign in order to abolish the sparrows. And it was called the campaign of the 4 great pests. The pests were the rats, which bring plague, the mosquitoes, which bring disease, the sparrow, which brings famine, as well as, I believe, the fly, which also brings disease. They call the sparrow to be a capitalist bird. I'm not even making this shit up. I don't know why they decided to do so, but the sparrow was the bird representing capitalism. And because of that, a lot of people ended up, as their civic duty, to destroy sparrow nests, to shoot down sparrows from the air if they had a gun, like if they were part of the military. But also to bang pots in order to scare sparrows from nesting and then forcing them to fly, hoping that they will die from exhaustion. They were surprisingly successful, and the sparrow population became almost extinct in China. Now, of course, there were some people that tried to raise alarm. There were some people that pointed out that maybe the ecosystem is not something we should bring Marxism into. Unfortunately, those people were swiftly marginalized as, well, being right-wingers or anti-revolutionaries. And being a right-winger or an anti-revolutionary in a communist society means you get to disappear. It's why most people decided not to be right-wingers or communist agitators and shut the fuck up. But as recently experts warned and scientists said, and studies show that while it is true that the sparrows do eat a lot of grain, it is also true that they eat a lot of insects. And doing the math, the number of insects that the sparrows eat during their lifetime compensates for the amount of grain that they consume, because it turns out that an invasion of locusts of biblical proportions descended upon China, and this bode very ill for agriculture. So this is why this type of famine wouldn't have happened in a free economy, because it would be very difficult in the United States to convince farmers to murder sparrows at an apocalyptical level. But again, this wasn't enough. The bad practices continued. Remember when I said that they wanted to industrialize? Well, because of this, they wanted to create steel. And they wanted to create so much steel that they would reach the United Kingdom, which had decades at the time of experience in manufacturing it, and already the system in place for this to happen naturally. And unlike the United Kingdom, Mao was not renowned to be a very patient man. He wasn't going to do this gradually and over time, and the people who suggested to do this gradually and over time were labeled right-wingers or counter-revolutionaries. So as such, he decided that farmers should start producing steel, and entire forests were being cut down in order to have wood for the furnaces to burn. And the forests didn't seem to be enough. Eventually, people started using any type of wood that they had in order to fuel the fires. And that wasn't enough. It's reported in certain literature that people even dug up the graves to pull the wood from the coffins in order to have the necessary fuel required for the steel.
Tables, chairs, window frames. And finally, we even opened old coffins and used the wood. They really stank.
So what does the steel have to do with famine? Well, it turns out that a peasant can't perform two tasks at once. Either he can work the field or he can produce steel. He can't really do both. Meaning that a lot of peasants were moved away from their farms and put into the production of steel, which caused grain and crops to literally rot on the fields because no one was there to harvest it. And as such, a lot of steel was produced, it's true, but turns out that just like any trade, you don't get it right the first time, so only 30% of the total steel was actually useful for the industry. The other 70% was discarded. And with this came the famine, which, again, you can see why people say communists create famine. You can't get this level of perfection into a capitalist system where all of the decisions just add up beautifully together in order to produce a real famine. In a capitalist society, maybe you have like a bad practice. Maybe, some scientists suggest you do something stupid and some farmers do it. Or maybe there's bad weather, or maybe, I don't know, like some war and the government decides to step in for a while. But it's very difficult to just have like this coordinated and calculated effort of human incompetence where everything just smoothly adds up in order to have like one of the world's worst famines that have transpired. And you're going to notice something else with authoritarians. This is not particularly for communists, but it's for authoritarians in general. The type of people that do make decisions, but they're never held into account for the decisions they make. So all of a sudden, instead of admitting that they were wrong, the communists slowly changed the four pests and removed the sparrow swiftly from that list and instead added the cockroach. And then they imported a lot of sparrows from the Soviet Union. And with that problem fixed, then they got to decide the most beautiful thing that communists tell me that insurance companies in the United States do. They decided who lives and who dies. You see, there wasn't enough food for everyone, and Mao said that it's better for some people to die so that other people get to eat properly. And of course, the inner party members were essential personnel. The old and the sick were a little bit not as essential, especially since the old and the sick were most likely to be right-wingers. I mean, they were people who lived a time before the famine. Horror stories, they're a dime a dozen if you look at the literature.
Family was a typical big family in the countryside, with several generations living together. There were 36 people altogether. During the 3 years of famine, one died after another. Eventually, only 3 people were left alive. At first, when someone died, they would take the body and bury it. Later, they didn't have the strength to take the bodies out. They could only look at them. They watched the bodies being eaten by rats and their eyeballs dug out.
On top of that, entire villages were considered to be non-essential, and it's where the military literally took away the food, surrounded the village, and allowed it to starve. And the food was redistributed to the people that actually needed. Party members or their friends and, activists, younger people. But then the international community wanted to help out. You see, the Red Cross was offering food. The United States wanted to offer food, but of course, Chinese Communist Party didn't want to lose face internationally, much like the Soviet Union didn't want to accept help during the Ukraine Chernobyl disaster. Neither did China want to admit that their economy is suffering. And as such, they donated food for free for their allies to show how plentiful China is, and it's just a far-right American conspiracy theory that China is experiencing any type of famine. As well as the aid was swiftly refused. And, this is why people don't really appreciate communism. It's not the ideology per se, and it's true, it's not real communism. Karl Marx would have probably not advocated for the situation to be mismanaged as such. The problem is, though, that once revolutionaries get into power, they realize that with said power, they can do pretty much whatever they want. And they also realize that they don't really understand many things that they think they do. You see, most communists in China weren't peasants. They weren't simple people. They were intelligent people from the academia, from the benches of universities. And these people thought they knew everything. Of course, the peasant is stupid for not planting the plants closer together. Of course, the birds are the problem because they eat too much grain. Of course, the problem is the bountiful harvest. No one is going to complain if we fidget the numbers. I mean, they were intellectual enough to know that they're not going to get caught. They're smarter than the other people. And by fidgeting a couple of numbers and sending it towards the chain of command, no one is going to know. Probably no one did know until people were asking, well, where's the food? Masters in economy, associating labor, moving people from the field to the industry. Things that in a free market society happen naturally and over time. In a free market, if you notice there's not enough food, then more people go farm, and they have a vested interest in doing so. In a controlled market economy, you have no choice. You do what you're told. Which is why, as Milton Friedman said, the most atrocities happen in controlled systems like prisons. They don't happen in free societies. And with that, I'll leave you with a joke to show that Romania was not as different than China, and this happened in most communist nations at the time. The joke is that the farmer had a pig dying from malnourishment. So he reports up to the cooperative owner that his pig gave birth to 2 piglets. The cooperative owner reports to the apparatchik that the pig gave birth to 8 piglets. The apparatchik reports to the press that the piglet gave birth to 16 piglets. And the press writes that through the magic of communism, we now have discovered the pig which gave birth to 100 piglets. So the dear leader, noticing that a pig has given birth to 100, is saying that 99 of the pigs are going to be given to export, and through the kindness of socialism, the farmer is going to allow to have 1 pig for himself. This is something that was a joke due to the fact that it happens so often. One of the open secrets we had here under communism, and an open secret was that we know that they know that we know, but we're not allowed to talk about it, was by looking at the beautiful harvest and the bountiful harvest that Romania had. If you did the math, in order to fit the quota of grain that we harvested every year, it was very likely that Romania was farming all the way into the heartlands of Hungary. Let me know what you guys think. I usually don't make these types of videos where I just ramble on about the story, but hopefully you enjoyed and you get a little bit more understanding why Eastern Europeans say that communism brings famine and how it's actually connected. It's not necessarily just because of human greed. It's usually because of mismanagement, because the people who end up being in charge don't end up being in charge because they are renowned for knowing what they are doing. Communist nations do not believe in meritocracy. As such, they can put anyone in charge. I'll see you guys in the comment section, and as usual, I'll be live streaming on my channel right now. There's a link into the pinned comment if you want to go there and see me talk about other issues. Take care.